Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage your moderator and distinguished panelists.
Wow. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's discussion. We're here to tackle a very important topic. How can economies emerging from conflict, how can they achieve stronger and more sustainable recoveries? This happens to be the subject of the second chapter of the IMF's Regional Economic Outlook for the Middle East and Central Asia, which will be released on the 21st of October, mark it in your calendars, in Dubai. But if you want an advance copy, where's the QR code? It's over there. You can scan the QR code, and you can get your advance copy.
Don't tell anybody.
With that advertisement out of the way on behalf of Jihad, I would like to move to introduce our very distinguished and highly experienced panelists. To my immediate left, we have His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Al-Jabbar, who is President of the Islamic Development Bank. And the Islamic Development Bank has supported over 40 member countries in emerging from conflict, in addition to Muslim communities in non-member countries, and has extensive experience, and he's no stranger to the IMF. He served as executive director for Saudi Arabia between 1988 and 1995, and has worked in the private sector and as a policymaker. Please give him a round of applause. Then we have Ms. Odile Renaud-Bousseau, who is president of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and the EBRD has been engaged in supporting countries emerging from conflict all around the world, including the Ukraine. Since 2022, the EBRD has supported Ukraine to the tune of over 8 billion euros. Please welcome her. And then we have, from just down the road, Professor Josh Hellman, who is Dean of the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He has done extensive work on governance all around the world, very complex cases and arrangements. And he worked at the World Bank. We won't hold it against him. But when he was there, he headed the World Bank's engagement with conflict and fragile states all around the world. Please welcome Professor Hellman. So the first question for you, Your Excellency. While all cases of recovery from conflict are different, recent work done by the fund points to three common drivers for successful outcomes. The first is macroeconomic stabilization, strengthening of institutions, and access to finance through international partners and also through debt restructuring. The question is, how should countries in the MENA region, Middle East and North African region, who are emerging from conflict, pursue macroeconomic stabilization in a climate of global uncertainty? What should policymakers prioritize in achieving that goal?
First, thank you, Nigel, and thank you, IMF. It's good to be back to an old home. Spent a good amount of my professional life here, so it's good to be back. The three conditions you talked about, I think they're like motherhood and apple pie. You know, it goes without saying, you need macro stabilization, you need all the preconditions. But I think in most countries, and I know from our experience at the Islamic Development Bank, we need to start with social cohesion and social stability within the society. You need to start with that. If you don't have that, all the others will not work as effectively as they should be. So social peace, social internal peace within these societies will have to be worked on. I think the international community can help a lot, because usually that social cohesion can be attained if the basic needs of the people that have suffered so much during the years of fragility are having these, basic things: food, health, and maybe education. That's all people that are coming and emerging out of conflict or fragility want. Here, I think there is a need for international solidarity to help these countries and their populations. Humanitarian aid is very important. We have been engaged, as you mentioned, in providing humanitarian aid at the early stages of resolution and at the early stages of peace in these societies. I was very impressed today listening to the Syrian Minister of Finance explaining what they have been doing. I think it is really a very interesting case study. I mean, of course, the jury is still out on the results, but I think they have been saying the right things and doing the right things in terms of working on the justice system. So justice that was missing, they're bringing it back quickly. That brings the buy-in you need from the population at large. They are making sure that there are no injustices related to minorities or sects or what have you. International community is needed here. Why? Because sometimes it's either internally or externally instigated. Sometimes, and there is a good need for the international community to collaborate to help calm down these age-old rivalries and difficulties, rather than pouring gas on the fire. This is really very, very important. Third point, it is critical that the basic institutions of a society are also built up or rebuilt early on. I mean, schools for children. I mean, you talk about, now we heard 2.5 million children, 2.5 million refugees have come back, and there will be like 3.5 million refugees come back to Syria. A lot of them are children. So what do you do? I mean, you need basic educational institutions. You need all the other institutions of civil societies to really ensure that they will forget about the pains of the past as much as they can and build into the future. Finally, because we're financial institutions, finance is paramount. We need to bring about finance to bear. We don't need billions and trillions all the time. Sometimes it's really how efficient the amounts that are provided are really put to good use in these societies. So I think attaining social peace is the most important condition. It will help with attaining macroeconomic stabilization. Again, I mean, I was so flabbergasted today. I mean, the minister from Syria, it is still a very poor country, just 6 months out of serious conflict. And he said that now their budget is balanced. I mean, of course, that means they're not spending enough on a lot of other things. You know, we know they do need that. But the fact that they are thinking about macroeconomic stability this early in the process is really indicative of the determination and at least the appreciation for what it takes to rebuild society. I think the IMF, all the other institutions, including the World Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, and all others, can really contribute to that. And clearly, some have already been provided. So those are, from our experience at the Islamic Development Bank, are really very important ingredients to attain.
So if I could follow on, you're saying social stability first.
Yes.
I hear you and can accept that. But within macroeconomic stability complex, what should the priorities be?
Well, as I said, I mean, for example, reforming the tax system, collecting, because he said they're collecting now taxes. And he said people are happy to pay it as long as they know that it will be put into good use. Even though this is a country that is now, at this stage, is very poor. It wasn't originally very poor, but now it's very poor. So the fact that they are doing this and working with international financial institutions to enhance their monetary, fiscal, and structural policies, I think is going to help bring about that macro stability.
And where does price stability lie in the fact that prices aren't running away? How important is that?
It's very important. The Syrians are very well known, for example. I mean, I hate to speak like a Syrian, but I'm proud of what I heard today because it's I mean, I was preparing for this meeting and I said, you know, we have a case study. He should be here with us, actually. But, you know, the fact that they are doing all of this at such an early stage is a proof that if you do it, you will attain that macro stability. If you don't, you have more difficulties in the future.
Thank you. Ms. Rosso Bossoon, drawing on the extensive experience of the EBRD and across a range of conflicts over time and across geographies, what would you say are the sets of challenges that countries emerging from conflict will always have to deal with? And how should those challenges be prioritized? Which should be addressed?
So here also, thank you for having me. I apologize in advance for my voice because I had a lot of meetings. I lost a bit my voice, but I hope I will be able, and you can hear me still. And indeed, it's an issue on which the bank has worked quite a lot because we've been created in a context of very challenging times, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emerging of new countries, new economies, and in some areas, some conflictual, very conflictual regions, for example, in the Western Balkans, where we invest in countries which have been in war not so long ago. So we've been working in this kind of environment, and with a mandate, the bank mandate is very much focused on the private sector. So a lot of things I will say will refer to the role of the private sector in conflict, post-conflict situation. We've also looked in our recent transition report, which is our flagship report, about what experience from wars learn us. And we've looked at a very wide number of war cases. So countries, I mean, it's 700 wars spanning 2 centuries, looking at the impact on the economy and the pace of recovery and so forth. It was at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. We did that in order to help us thinking a bit about what needs to be done and how to address the situation. The reality is that wars, very generally speaking, leave very deep scars in the economy, in the society. So recovery from war is very, very challenging. And reconstruction in particular difficult when peace is fragile. Very often, we talk about war and peace, but very often you have also a situation where it's uneven, the peace is very fragile, you have a ceasefire, but it's not a full-fledged peace agreement, the war may start again, and so forth. And this is an element that needs to be taken into account because it has a strong bearing on economic dynamics and the recovery. So what we've seen from that is that GDP per capita returned to 5 years in 30% of the case. So you have a return to the GDP per capita before the war, after 5 years, in 30% of the case. In nearly half of the country, after 25 years, the economy, the GDP per capita, has not recovered the situation pre-crisis. So it means in nearly half of the countries, the time for recovery is more than 25 years. And only in 1 year, 1 war in 5 wars is followed by 20 years of sustained peace. So really, very often you also go back to war, and only in 1 conflict out of 5, the peace is still there 5 years at the end of the first war. So this shows how challenging it is to be able to address the post-conflict situation and to really provide, all the tools and the necessary policy for recovery. I think the first challenge, you were talking about the challenges. What are the challenges? The main challenges, I would say 3. The first one is, after a war situation, the economy is very, very fragile, generally speaking, so you have different intensity of war, different kind of impact, but there is really a lack of trust in the economy, a very strong reputational damage, a perception of risk which is very high. So foreign investors are not going to jump into the country and say, well, we are going to invest massively because the political instability, the potential loss that have taken place during the war, that still has a bearing, that still has an impact. And so it's very difficult to bring back private sector very quickly. And that's why external support and aid is so important, that a self-sustained recovery is extremely rare and I think very difficult to reach. The second very important component is the resilience of the institutions. And in the institution, you were talking about the judicial system. It's all, I think, all the institutions which are rebuilding resilient institutions, credible institution is absolutely fundamental. And depending on the war, it can be different situation, but first of all, the political institution, the capacity to have a decision-making process, parliament functioning, security ensured. So the basic fundamental institution, but also the economic policy institution, the central bank being able to stabilize the currency, being able to develop a credible monetary policy, tax system, judicial system, all this is absolutely fundamental and will determine, I think, the trajectory of the economy and the reconstruction. And the third element is rebuilding human capital and the resilience of human capital. Very often you have transferred population displaced, maybe outside of the country. You have population displaced in the country. So being able to address and to rebuild human capital is fundamental. We see in Ukraine, for example, the impact, the displaced people situation, 6 million of people have left the country. You also see the impact of people who have been fighting, who have been involved in the war. So very often, getting out with a physical handicap or a post-traumatic stress, with very challenging situation for them to be able to come back to the labor market. Sorry, too fast. to find a new job opportunities. So all this is very important. I will stop here.
Okay, I'll give you a chance to. Moving on to you, Professor Hellman, we just heard that many times in recoveries, you're characterized by fragility. We know that stabilization economically can play a role, but recoveries are likely to be more sustained if institutions are strengthened, and some of those were mentioned just now. The question is, how can policymakers ensure that stabilization not only addresses the immediate needs of people, but also can be leveraged to build institutions, ensuring that recoveries are lasting and durable?
Well, again, like others, let me thank you for having me. It's great. I'm close by, but it's nice to be back here in the IMF building and close to the World Bank. You're absolutely right that the key to sustainable development in fragile and conflict-affected states and regions is their ability to create long-term institutions that are going to secure that stability. And we all know that institution building is the hardest part of development. It's the hardest part of development in stable environments. It's especially hard, of course, in environments that are impacted by the kinds of trauma that the previous speakers mentioned. So the question is, what can you really do when, of course, there are so many immediate pressing needs, as you rightly point out, for stabilization, for healing, for kind of some immediate humanitarian assistance, some basic reconstruction, housing, providing food in some cases, where it's lacking depending on the case. How do you really begin to think about institution building when there are so many more urgent needs and everything seems so much more pressing? And I think the answer relates to, I think, a key point that the president of the EBRD made, which it begins with human capital and begins with human capacity building. Because institutions from the outside really can't be built. They can't be certainly imposed, and they really can't be brought over on a mission. You can bring over the rules, you can bring over the guidebooks, you can bring over the experience of other countries and hand those over to your counterparts in country. But of course, those things are just guideposts, those things are examples. You can't put institutions in a box and carry them across oceans and experience. So what you really need to do is build up sustained interaction with the officials that will be eventually tasked with building those institutions. And you can do that through the process of stabilization. You could do that through the process of immediate and short-term needs. But the question is, how do you invest in capacity building at the level of officialdom, so that you are essentially exposing those officials to what good institutions could be, what experiences are around the world, what they can learn from that, even if they're not going to immediately put that into practice? And how do you have sustained engagement? One of the things that I was arguing during the years that I had in the World Bank was that what that meant, and I think one of the biggest problems that you see in fragile and conflict-affected environments, is that the level of sustained engagement between government players and official institutions has itself been damaged by the conflict and fragility. It's often been the case that no one's been traveling there for many years because of the safety and security situations. It's often the case that the local offices of the major institutions are not fully staffed because of the dangers and security risks. It's often the case that people don't have as much experience. You don't have as large a local staff contingent. And so what I was always pushing for was the need for our collective international institutions to begin early on with a deep and sustained in-country presence, where you have the kind of one-to-one engagement with government officials, even if it's not necessarily building a new judicial system or building long-term institutions, but even on the immediate task, just to have that level of sustained engagement so that you are bringing more experience to the table, you are bringing up the level and standards and engagement and awareness, and then you gradually, as they themselves move towards more institution building tasks, have deeper relationships with the institutions, deeper understanding and openness and engagement with those institutions, and readiness to receive and seek advice as they seek to craft institutions that make sense in their own environment. So it goes back to the issue of human capacity building, and I think for our institutions, in particular for international financial institutions, it's having the sustained level of engagement, especially in country, to be able to build the foundation that will ultimately lead to institution building.
Yeah, you speak about foundation, and we certainly know that in stable societies, institutions evolve. In fragile and conflicted states, you are building institutions almost by prescription. And the question therefore arises, how should the institution building process be sequenced? What should come first? May I ask the question the other way, based on experience and things that you've seen? What are some of the examples of sequencing that you want to avoid in institutional building in fragile and post-conflict states?
Do you want me to start?
Yes.
I'll give you an example, very specific. In Afghanistan, for example, there was an effort to try to strengthen local institutions in Afghanistan. And literally there was a plan, and some of you who worked in Afghanistan will remember this. Can we create a project? And there was really a thought of developing a World Bank finance project of essentially local government in a box. And I literally, that was the metaphor used. Can we, in one kind of convenient package, try to say, this is what a local government does, these are the rules, processes, procedures, this is the institutional framework that you should use, and we could bring that to you. Now, obviously, we can't impose it upon you. We don't suggest to impose it upon you. But this gives you almost a toolkit. Is it possible to create a toolkit, for essentially standing up local government? Doesn't work. I mean, it just doesn't work. This notion that you can import institutional forms that would develop. Only in the rarest of cases. The EBRD is probably one of the most interesting, because when countries, although they weren't as fragile and conflict affected, joined the European Union, they literally had to sign up to a set of institutions that were very prescriptive. What we know in conflict and fragile affected states is that kind of environment, that kind of knowledge transfer for institution building doesn't work. There's so much uniqueness, so much context, so much calibration between capacity and institutional development that has to happen, that it really does have to come from within, and it has to come from deep knowledge and engagement on the ground.
Well said. I think we're going to come back to that in a moment. Your Excellency, if I can ask you, we mentioned earlier that financing is incredibly important to efforts emerging from conflict and fragility. What role would you say multilateral institutions, international organizations have in ensuring that financing is effective in its implementation and aligned with the interests of the citizens of the conflict-affected state? And how can it achieve those two objectives?
I think, and at the outset, the multilateral development institutions should engage with the governments and the peoples of those countries in a very sympathetic way, which I mean that they will see where are the areas that can be improved significantly. Don't build a steel mill out in the desert, let's say, but go and provide small financing to micro and small and medium scale industries that will hire all of those people that have found themselves with no work. This is a very effective way of using finance for such communities. Entrepreneurship can be helped to develop in those countries through such financing that is focused on such enterprises. This will empower people. This will make them feel that they are part and parcel of the new society and that they can reap the benefits of a market economy. Because the problem, which I think the question that Professor Holman answered, that you raised, is what should they avoid? I think avoid statism in the economy, where the state will do everything. This is not a good start. The good start is to empower the small and medium scale, micro, small and medium scale industries to really lead the development of the country. With the government providing the institutional framework, so there is reasonable regulation, not controlling regulation, but streamlining regulation that will empower those that are interested in providing help. So the MDBs, I think they have been doing a good job in meeting and visiting those countries and providing financial but also advisory services to ensure that the prospects are good and that the wrong solutions are not pursued.
Just break it down a little bit for us. I mean, there's certainly some financing that could be interchangeable, it could be public or private, but there are certain categories of financing that are definitely public.
Yeah.
And if we could focus on that for a moment, the financing that comes to help a post-conflict state rebuild its education system, or provide health care and to build hospitals, or just to finance the operations of for social support and the civil service, etc. How can multilateral institutions ensure that such financing is effectively used and aligned with the interests of the country?
Engagement. You can't just, sign a loan or a financing and then say, okay, I trust you, do it. No, there has to be engagement, sympathetic, not condescending, dictating, advisory, but rather somebody sympathetic will say, look, and it worked in that country for these good reasons, it didn't work in that country for that bad reason. So avoid this, we recommend that you avoid this and do this. So that level of engagement has proven to be effective in many countries. And I think it is important that we don't forget these lessons of successful experiences. The unsuccessful experiences are very costly. These societies cannot afford. They have scarce resources, and therefore, as you said, health, education, those are public goods primarily. So the government has to spend. But then they should not forget that at the end, you need an economy that is producing goods and services needed by the population and maybe even exported. That should be looked at from the outset, but without neglecting, of course, the initial needs of health and education. Those are very, very important, and multilateral development institutions have been reasonably good at that in terms of providing that help.
So what's the role for procurement systems in post-conflict state to ensure value for money as far as financing is concerned? I mean, the procurement system probably doesn't exist. So what are the solutions to that
Well, I think we have, for example, in our institution, we have a procurement system that we insist that it be applied before we award contracts that we are financing. And we transfer that knowledge. So there is also a huge amount of knowledge transfer that is needed from more experienced countries and from multilateral development institutions to these emerging societies. This is very important, and it has given great dividends where it was done. We have, for example, we're very active, for example, with reverse linkage, South-South cooperation, where a lot of the achievements of some member countries are transferred to other member countries, be it in health, or be it in rural development, or be it in land reform, or be it in some of the technology, the digitization of societies. I mean, for example, we have Tunisian help going to Mauritania, for example, to transfer these digital systems for government payments and for other reasons. And there are so many examples, and that reduces the cost and spreads the knowledge to a larger number of beneficiaries, and it worked.
Just jump into Professor Hellman. The private sector came up, and small and medium-sized businesses. What role, if you could expand on, what role does the private sector have in reconstruction, or not in reconstruction, in emerging from conflict and in the context of fragility? And how can international institutions, multilateral institutions help in the process of building private sector capacity?
Well, first of all, I think the private sector is absolutely critical. I mean, it's absolutely critical to the long-term health. It's critical to the long-term growth. It's critical to the employment and the capacity building. It's absolutely essential, and it is, perhaps the single most important aspect of sustainable development in these countries, and what they're most lacking and what has been most impacted. I think there's a lot of very interesting challenges to that. First, one of the interesting things is that even during wartime, there is a vibrant private sector. It's just a vibrant private sector that's focused on destruction, right. And one can't ignore that. I actually tried to push for a better understanding of what war economies and how war economies function, because you have to build a new private sector on the basis of whatever private sector activity was ongoing, even during the most difficult periods of time. So you have to transform. And if you have a war economy, that means you have a power structure, you have individuals who earned, you have people who will be reluctant to give up some of the rents that they were receiving. So really, it's a question of not only how do you build a private sector, which is a challenge, of course, in all developing countries, and how do you feed and nourish that, but it's really how do you transition from a war economy, which shapes economic activity, to one that is productive. So I think that's a challenge which I don't think any of our institutions, to be perfectly honest, have a full understanding of, because we don't know so much about the dynamics of a war economy. The second thing I would say, and I can say this now as I am not employed by any international financial institution, is that the hardest thing to do for an international financial institution is to invest in the private sector. Because the private sector in a fragile and conflicted country is all about risk. It's such a tremendously risky activity that I know when I was working within the institution, and I can't speak for the EBRD and I wouldn't speak for the EBRD, but in the IFC and MIGA, just applying the normal standards that IFC and MIGA apply to its regular business practices that the shareholders expected of them, to engage in relatively modest risk, to ensure that the portfolio remained healthy, the overall IFC portfolio remained healthy. It meant that there's just so much risk that you could take on in the private sector. So it is the hardest nut to crack, I think, for international financial institutions, because that's where the risk is, and that's where the most difficult thing is for you to invest, profitably and productively. How to figure that out, I think it's about loosening restrictions and rules and recognizing and embracing the level of risk that you're going to have to embrace to work in those fragile and conflict environments. But then that's up to the shareholders to see whether or not they're willing to accept that level of risk.
No, thank you. A lot of food for thought there. Ms. Renaud Bossou, you converge with Dr. Al-Jaber in stressing how the nature of fragility and the nature of the social bonds that fall away during times of conflict. He stated that that is the most important foundation. You said it in another way. Can you get a little more granular on that and share with us what are some of the main strategies that you have seen throughout your time as effectively being able to rebuild social bonds and deal with the concerns that various factions within society may have, or the grievances that various factions may have?
So indeed, I think that's a key element, and maybe I can, to illustrate what we can do, focus on what we are doing currently in Ukraine, where we, in our investment, always look at the human capital dimension. So when we support a company in the private sector, and I will come back to what you said because I think it's very important, but a company in the private sector or a public sector company, the infrastructure and so forth, bringing what we can do together with this investment in order to facilitate human capital dimension, in order to facilitate reintegration of veterans, in order to upskill people who have been brought in the labor market but not necessarily with all the training and so forth. So, and we've mobilized, so we do it ourselves with our sort of accompanying the project with this kind of policy advice, policy support, but we also mobilized the business communities. For example, we have a platform with the banking system, all the banks in Ukraine, that commit themselves to take into account this dimension in their recruitment, in the equipment of their facilities, so as to allow people, handicapped people, to come in the banks and get access to money. And so, and we had this partnership with banks, but also with manufacturing system. And we realize that for our clients, for businesses, it's extremely helpful to have a sort of external support to be able to do that, because they have so many priorities they need to deal with, from the production, how they're going to export, I mean, a lot of challenges. But bringing this dimension earlier on, even when the war is still going on, is extremely important, because you could very well imagine a big divide. You have part of people who are not in the front, doing their day job, living more or less as normal, as usual. And you have people who are really fighting every day in very, very difficult situations for a long time. They do not have capacity to come back to see their family and so forth. And when they are demobilized, you need to handle this kind of, very big gap in what has been the experience in the war, what have then gone through into these very difficult years. And so thinking about that very early on and embarking with all the businesses and our public sector interlocutors is very important. I wanted to react on what you were saying about continuing to invest. One of the experience we have now with this war in Ukraine is a big effort on our side, and I think all the international community, to continue to provide support and to support the real economy and the private sector despite the war being there. And I remember very well at the beginning of the war, you know, the first reaction of IFIs is to say, oh, we cannot continue to support. And we need to suspend, it's too risky, we don't know. And after really quickly, after 1 or 2 months, we really realized that it was extremely important to be able to continue to support the real economy. Then the IMF came with a program and so forth, because the more you keep the economy going, the business functioning, the easier it will be to do the reconstruction, because people still have jobs, companies continue to run, they continue to produce. This generates revenues for the budget that support the government in the current context. So this is absolutely key, I think. And it's challenging because the security situation is challenging, because the level of risk is challenging. But I think it's a very, when you think about it, the impact of the investment, it's the most impactful investment you can do. And I think it's really worthwhile, because the more the economy is resilient now, the less we will have to invest later on. And to do that, I think we found ways to share the risk, a lot of donor support, so and blended finance in that kind of context is absolutely needed. We also got the support from shareholders to increase capital, so to have a sort of buffer to be able to absorb losses. But I think we don't know how the situation will evolve and so forth, but I think it's a very effective way to be, already preparing for the reconstruction and already rebuilding infrastructure that need to be rebuilt and so forth, and not wait and disengage, and when everything is settled, be able to come back. It's very challenging, and it depends on each war situation, each country situation and so forth, but I think it's a very useful example and quite compelling example.
Okay. Thank you. At this point, we're going to open up the floor. If there are any questions that anyone has, we have 2 microphones in over here and there. I'm happy asking all the questions, but I'm sharing the opportunity. Okay, we have 1 question. Yes, please. Just stand behind him.
Hi, sorry. My name is
Yes, go ahead, please.
I am a graduate student at GW. I was wondering if you could have... Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering if you could have any advice for non-Middle Eastern or Eastern European conflicts, such as reconstruction in Colombia or in other parts of Latin America or wherever else conflict may arise in the future.
Who wants to take that? You want to take that, Prof?
The question is advice from outside of Eastern Europe or the Middle East. Well, I go back to something that you said earlier, which is that the context, every post-conflict and fragile situation is very different. It is very, very difficult to sort of say that there's a common playbook or a common set of lessons, because the contexts are so specific. Usually the level of destruction can be vastly different in different situations. The underlying existing capacity that you try to maintain during conflict is very different. The nature of violence, you talked about Latin America. Now, for example, you have deeply fragile situations that are affected not by war or civil conflict, but by violence, by criminal violence, by gang violence, even by domestic violence in some countries. So the nature of violence differs in different regions. So I think there are some common lessons about the kinds of flexibility that one needs to work in such different contexts and be able to craft solutions for those different contexts. So I think there's some commonality in the flexibility that's required. The one, I think, common theme across all of these countries is that the level of risk is so much higher, whether it's specific, economic risk associated with investments, risk to staff, reputational risks related to corruption, which is common across all forms of violence. So I think there are some common themes that cross all regions and all types of fragile and conflicted situations, but I think each one is so remarkably different that it's hard to draw generalizations.
Thank you. Oh, we have a number of questions. You want to go next?
Hi. I have a question that you sort of touched on by bringing up gang and domestic violence. This is for everyone on the panel, but I'm more interested on trauma versus risk. How do you suppose that multilateral organizations approach economies and societies devastated by sexual and gender violence, like in Haiti, where there's a bigger need for trauma-informed care than economically based care?
Who wants to take that?
Yeah, the level of trauma. The question was how do you deal with trauma, especially trauma associated with domestic violence and sexual violence, which is one of the most horrific aspects of conflicts and modern conflicts we're seeing now. It is an extraordinarily complex subject. One thing I will say, I have seen in a number of conflict situations or post-conflict situations the use of various different community-driven development schemes that are designed to bring communities together around choices for common investments that if well crafted could bring in those people that are sort of been most impacted by the violence, that might be impacted by the trauma, and get them engaged in local decision making. That might be some way of bringing them back to the community. That's just one way, but it is one of the most difficult and complex issues.
No, very, very quickly, MDBs can support, or a development community can support some sort of dedicated program for psychological support, post-trauma support, and so forth. So it's very difficult. Then you need also to enlarge it, and that's where bringing communities is important, but there are tools to do that.
Okay, let's take one from over here, and we're probably going to group the questions just in the interest of time. So maybe one from here, and then you.
All right, thank you. Dr. Gidado Taufik Mcdad from Nigeria. I want to appreciate the speakers, and I want to posit that the spending pattern is important for us to pay attention to. Because by the time you are, like the president of IDB said, that you have to be sympathetical to those you are giving money to, you have to also look at the spending pattern, that when you give them the money, you have to engage them to ensure that the money you're giving to them is not used to buy arms. It's actually meant to develop people. And finally, on social cohesion, I think it is important for us, as much as we're trying to deal with conflict, we also have to deal with the cost of the conflict. Of course, we have spoilers everywhere, so that we don't have the conflict benefactors benefiting from the conflict, whereas we are imploding the life of the people and destroying their future. So I think it's important for us to invest in preventive measures so that conflicts are taken off and people can live the life of fruition and prosperity.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm with the Stimson Center here in Washington, and my question really for anyone who'd like to take it on the panel is to ask, what are the particular challenges and opportunities in a post-conflict setting for multilateral development banks where there's an abundance of certain kinds of natural resources?
Okay, those two questions. How do you stop the resources from going to buy arms, and how do you, replace the incentives in the war economy? Question here about natural resources. How do multilaterals interface in post-conflict societies where minerals are a part of the equation?
I think I can briefly address the first one because you raised it earlier also when you asked about procurement.
Yes.
Because I think procurement systems have been evolving very well, where the spending goes where it is expected to go. And it's not as in the mind of some observers that this is money, given by one institution, given to the government and say, you do, and we trust you and all of this. There are very sophisticated procurement systems where the payments are based on invoices that are verified by auditors and all of that. And this is good, I think. It's good for the receiving country, so it's not just getting the debt and not getting the benefits.
Right.
And that is very important.
Okay, excellent. Maybe we take 3 questions, 2 from this line and 1 from here. Can we go?
You don't know, the critical raw material question.
Huh?
The critical raw material question.
The second one. Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
the second one. You forgot.
Go ahead, go ahead.
No, just when the countries are critical raw material, of course, post-conflict, it could be an area where you have investors and private investors interested in developing and exploiting this raw material, and that's a good opportunity to generate activity, generate business, and so forth. Of course, one of the key questions, I think, will be how to ensure that the recipient country, the countries benefit as much as it can about the value, and there are a lot of expectation more and more to get more transformation at the country level and not just exporting the raw material. But I think that's a good opportunity for countries.
Thank you. All right, 2 questions here and then 1 from here.
Hi, I'm Liana Zagbi. I'm with Syrian Forum. My question is, as an organization like us that works on economic empowerment on ground in Syria, and we even have like an investment fund that we created under our organization, what are the best places that civil society can engage with the different development banks to work on economic empowerment? And what do the banks themselves seek from civil society in order to better inform your methodology as you're just beginning to re-engage with our country? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Alimata Koulibaly. I'm originally from Mali, CEO of Maverick Global Management Consulting. We are working towards sustainable development goals. So everywhere we want to work with Africa, the African continent, because it's an emerging continent. So now my question is, how can we recover, how the African continent can recover from all the crises, whether it's economical crisis, whether it's political crisis. All the countries want to be partnered with African countries, but yet we are still struggling. So I want to know what is the future of Africa when it comes to recovering. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. 3rd question here.
Yes, my name is Julio Cesar Guiti Guevara, originally from Honduras, grounded here in DC through a consulting firm named SUDEC. My question is, can you please share your thoughts about de-risking subnational government to facilitate a greater allocation of resources, considering the fact that often the recovery process requires a very targeted approach. And in the multilateral space, we are used to deal with national or federal governments. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you want to go first?
Yes, on the economic empowerment, that's something where we have developed as a bank, and I think others are doing the same, a lot of programs, for example, to support women empowerment, young people empowerment, and we do that very often through the local banks, providing technical assistance on top of funding, because to develop the business capacities and so forth. And we build that very often with NGOs, so working with CSO, civil society, or NGOs in order to design and bringing additional support, so for to increase the empowerment to women or to young women participating in this program.
Go ahead, Prof.
Yeah, if I can take the question on subnational governments, which is a really important question, and I have seen, especially the wisdom in the IFIs, is this view that the closer you get government to the people, the more accountable it's going to be, which sounds great. But if we go back to the fact that, especially in fragile and conflict-affected environment, capacity is limited, the idea that capacity is going to be able to be spread over more and more sort of subnational entities, I think is maybe going a little too far. I think we tend to over-romanticize subnational governments, and it can become difficult to be able to provide the kind of capacity sort of support. Ultimately, you will need to provide subnational government support if that's the structure of the country, and that is going to be critical to its ultimate long-term development. But I actually think if the issue is how do you have sustained engagement on the ground, that is largely going to be either at the sort of central government level, the building on ministries, building on a central government capacity. And I think that going much further than that might strain the capacity locally as well as strain the capacity of the IFIs to engage with it. It's a controversial point of view. Not everyone agrees to it, but I do think that we've perhaps gone too far in thinking that you will truly empower subnational governments and hold them accountable.
Thank you. All right, last two questions, and then we wrap up.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum. Shalom. I'm Alfian from Indonesia. I'm a Georgetown MBA student. So speaking about the engagement and specifically talking about private sector engagement here. So if we talk about private sector, they tend to seeking for the profit, and then they're looking for sharing the risk. And my question would be, how can the private sector ensure to be invested in an area and then share the risk with the involvement of multilateral institution or public sector? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is Dr. Josefi Sakadudban from Chad. I'm the Director of Cooperation and Institutional Partnerships at the Ministry of Youth. My question is to the Islamic Bank for Development and the European Bank. What innovative financing solutions and partnerships models do you see as most effective to support a region like Sahel, and particularly a country like Chad? And in general case, how to change the current narrative we have vis-a-vis Europe? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Al-Jasser, was directly targeted at you?
Let me talk about the last question. Not talking about Chad specifically as it was raised, but countries in that region or in similar situation. I think it is important at a very early stage to identify the most pressing needs of a society. Sometimes one region, that food spoils, and another region of the same country, there are people starving. So really, a road between that region and that region is going to be so transformational. So that identification of such projects, I mean, we were talking about Syria. I was talking with the minister about electricity, for example. They are short of electricity, so even small factories don't have enough power. People in homes, their refrigerators don't work because they get electricity for 3 hours. So they can't even maintain the food that they have. So prioritizing is really the most important thing. And we at the Islamic Development Bank, we work with countries. That's why I always tell them, we start from where you end. We try to identify the needs of those countries first. Just short comment, maybe others will, but on the private sector and profit, well, if you want a market economy, you better use the market signals. And the market signals, one of the most important market signals is profit. And if it's you want to drive a very efficient economy, then those profits are going to play a great role. With very efficient economy, those profit levels will go down because competition will come back trying to reap those successive profits. But at the final analysis, that's going to promote the production of goods and services in a society and lead to growth. So profit is not such a bad word after all.
Anything to add?
Well, I would just, in closing, because there were two questions about African empowerment and on Chad, and one of the things that concerns me most about the current moment that we're living in, the current environment that we're living in, is that Africa has largely fallen off the map of discussion and engagement if you live in this country, in the United States. And yet, what we see if we project out the trends, declining growth rates, which we are sort of seeing over the next decade. We are seeing extremely high levels of indebtedness in all less developed countries, but those are increasingly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. We're seeing conflict and fragility also concentrating in sub-Saharan Africa. And yet at the same time, we are seeing this truly remarkable demographic boost. So much so that, within 20 years, 1 of every 4 children in the world born will be born in Africa. So what that is telling us is in an era of declining growth, demographic change, and increasing indebtedness, which is shrinking the fiscal space to invest in health and education, we really are sort of setting ourselves up. Whatever problems has been discussed here in Chad and Mali and other places, you ain't seen nothing yet in comparison to what we will see as that demographic boom hits in a low growth environment, in a high debt environment. So from my view, the urgency of addressing and putting these issues at the center of our attention is absolutely critical. So I'm so glad that some of the questioners brought that up, and I hope at these meetings it is going to be a central topic of the discussion of the shareholders and others who are here thinking about this.
Thank you very much. On that note, it remains for me to thank our distinguished panelists. Please give them a round of applause. And to also thank the MCD department who put on a seminar that is obviously of great interest based on the questions and the number of questions that have been asked. Please give them a round of applause as well. Thank you very much.